Hello, everyone. In less than 30 minutes, the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics opening ceremony will officially begin, signaling to the world that the International Olympic Committee and all of its sponsors value profit and pandering to the Chinese government more than condemning genocide. The opening ceremony in Beijing represents repression and sports wash genocide. Our alternate opening ceremony today represents resilience and solidarity. My name is Tenzin McGlade, but you can call me Migs. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the North American Grassroots Coordinator at Students for a Free Tibet, currently based in New York, but I immigrated to the US from India in 2004.
Hi, everyone, and I'm an activist historian, often from Hong Kong, currently based in Washington. I'm the Policy and Research Fellow of the Hong Kong Democracy Council, the leading nonprofit organization for Hong Kong's democracy movement and Hong Kongers in the US, as well as a PhD candidate at Georgetown University. I've been in the US since 2013.
The International Olympic Committee failed the world when they awarded the summer 2008 Olympics to China, even though China was actively committing a cultural genocide in Tibet at the time. It's been over 13 years now, and China's crimes against humanity have only evolved and expanded. Never in my wildest dreams did I think we'd be forced to witness the sports washing of genocide begin again. The IOC must be held accountable for their complicity in awarding China the 2022 Winter Olympics. But speaking of 2008, Jeffrey, what do you remember of those Beijing Olympic Games?
Yeah, well, it's been 14 years, and at the time I was still in Hong Kong. And 2008, I think, was just such a very different moment, especially for us Hong Kongers. I mean, it was a little over a decade since the 1997 handover of Hong Kong's sovereignty at the time. And there was just a lot of sort of optimism for most Hong Kongers that one country, two systems was going to work, and that Beijing had reason to show to the international community that it was going to be a responsible actor and therefore living up to promises of democracy for Hong Kongers. There were a few protests, but relatively speaking, on the whole, there was not the kind of full-scale mobilization, of civil society in terms of protesting the government and all that. And things have just changed so much. But I remember 2008. It was really a time when a lot of Hong Kongers felt that they could be a part of China. One country, two systems could work, and there was even a sense of pride for a lot of Hong Kongers that China was going to rise, and the Olympics was a way for the international community to recognize that. What about you?
So I was actually 9 at the time, and I don't remember a lot, but I do remember just this overwhelming sense of urgency throughout my community. There seemed to be a protest happening somewhere around the world almost every single weekend that year. And I remember thinking it was so strange that our families who otherwise valued education so highly were now taking us out of school to attend these protests and watch direct actions like the historic Golden Gate Bridge banner drop happening in real time. And what's most striking is when news broke that Tibetans in Tibet were actually protesting the Olympics. That really shook a lot of us to our core. I think it was definitely a turning point for a lot of Tibetans in exile. And strangely, more than the direct actions and events of 2008, I remember the news of the vicious crackdowns and brutality in Tibet that followed after the 2008 Olympics were actually somewhat even more harrowing. I mean, did China think that we would just forget what happened in 2008? The events of 2008 and the years that followed inspired an entire generation of Tibetans in exile, including me. And the irony of it all is that it's all a testament to the resilience of the Tibetan movement, that the very kids that witnessed the events of 2008 are now the activists leading the Tibetan freedom movement.
Yeah, for sure. And I think just because the crackdown in Tibet by the Chinese government has just been so long and going on for so many decades, and that has shaped the experiences of Tibetans in Tibet and also Tibetans abroad in exile, etc. And that, I think, has led to what I would say the Tibetan community just being so ahead of us, us in terms of Hong Kongers on recognizing how problematic it would be to award China the Olympic Games. In 2008, as I said a moment ago, I mean, there was trust. There was a very high level of trust in in Hong Kong toward the government. And even in Taiwan, I mean, in 2008, they held a presidential election, and they actually elected KMT, which is the more pro-unification party, for president. And so it was just, across the strait, toward the Chinese government, the attitude was so different. And I can't say I remember a lot firsthand. And I've learned a lot just, reading news articles and information just in retrospect. But from what I do remember, I think most Hong Kongers at least would have heard of, protests related to Tibet, but the general consensus was that this was something far and distant. It was an ethnic conflict, and most Hong Kongers just could not see how that would be relevant to us. And 14 years later, just because of the increasing crackdown, especially since Xi Jinping has become general secretary in late 2012, early 2013. The crackdown has increased, obviously, not only continuing on Tibetans, but also on us Hong Kongers, military threats against Taiwan, and since I would say 4 or 5 years ago, when information began coming out in terms of the treatment of Uyghurs, what we're seeing really, and for all of you watching today, a much bigger coalition of activists, far bigger coalition than 2008, protesting the second time that Beijing is allowed to host the Olympics. And I think that speaks to not only the importance of solidarity, but also the reality that China today is just a much more irresponsible actor on the international stage compared to China in 2008.
Yeah, and clearly Jeffrey and I were largely spectators during the 2008 Beijing Olympics.
Well, in our defense, we were young. But now we have two human rights activists who remember the 2008 protests all too well. Mandy is the executive director of the International Tibet Network, and we have Pema Yoko joining us as well. She's the former director of Students for Free Tibet.
All right, so hello. First and foremost, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. And
hi.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Can I just say, I'm not sure I like the inference that we're old.
Wiser, experienced.
Exactly, experienced. That's a great word for it.
But I think the question that's been on my mind ever since I heard that we'll be interviewing y'all is, at the time, why were the 2008 protests so important, and what memories, I guess, specifically stand out to you during that time?
Mandy, do you want to go first?
Well, I mean, it kind of seems like a long time ago, but I'm sure Pema and I both believe that it also seems like it was kind of yesterday. 2008 was a time when we hadn't. What was so amazing was pre the Olympics, we hadn't seen mass protests in Tibet for decades. I mean, literally decades. And then come March 2008, the Tibetan plateau rocketed with protests. Thousands and thousands of Tibetans came out onto the streets to raise their voices against all the odds, against severe repression, and knowing that their lives were seriously in danger by them doing that. They came out and they literally shouted from the rooftops about the fact that Tibet was under this brutal occupation and they did not want it and they wanted freedom, and that drove the Tibetan movement so high, and plans for the Olympics really developed, and we as activists knew that we had to take those voices of the Tibetans who had been so brave and be brave ourselves and go to Beijing and to take as much action as we possibly could. And and it was amazing, and the results were absolutely incredible, as Pema will attest. Pema, what was it like for you?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, when I remember protesting as a young teenager outside the Chinese embassy, thinking what are Tibetans actually feeling right now inside Tibet? Because at that time we didn't have much information. There wasn't content in the news. But I was a member of Free Tibet campaign at the time, and I used to read their newsletters. And I remember, the Drubji nuns at that time, and I think Nong Sangula was like 13 years old when she was arrested, and it always that thought, I always felt I wanted to do something more than just stand outside the Chinese embassy with 10 people. What else can I do? And I didn't know at the time what I could do. And my friend from Norway came to London, Tibetan friend, and I wanted to catch up with her. And she's like, I'm going to be at this conference, this thing by Students for Free Tibet I had never heard of, I didn't really know much about, and I literally wanted to go there to see my friend. And then I was in a 2-day training suddenly, and I remember this whiteboard that they just wrote. As soon as you entered, it just said, "Where will you be in 2008?" And I was like, "Yeah, what's this about?" And they explained about the Olympics and everything, and I just knew that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to do something for Tibet. I wanted to be a part of this campaign. If I have to go to China or Tibet or wherever, I will do it. I wanted to do it, and through the training that they supported me through, not just SFT but our allies, I was able to go to Tibet, to China, and protest there, and it was an honor to go there and a privilege, really, because as well as the risks involved, but it was a privilege because I know at the time there was a lot of Tibetans, young Tibetans, and Tibetans of all ages wanted to do something and wanted to go. But it's hard to get visas and everything. And I think the ones that could go, we were 3 Tibetans who are half Tibetans, I think, and we all have mixed names. So Pema Yoko, and we were able to get in. And I think after seeing the uprising across Tibet, it was literally all people from all walks of life, monks, nuns, teachers, parents, students, teenagers, like not just from one region, it was like the nation. And so that to me was like, okay, I hear what they're saying, and they're really taking this opportunity to tell the world that they're not happy under China's rule. And I knew that I have this privilege and this passport to go to China and echo their voices, which I think we did really well in 2008.
Yeah, I just want to take a second to say how extremely brave it was of anyone, that all the activists that actually went into China, because obviously it's much more well documented today, but even then we knew that China systemically used torture on on prisoners and human rights defenders that were in detention. And so it, like electric shock batons, spiked bats, neck cuffs, waterboarding, beating, sexual violence, isolation, stabbing, hanging from cables. Those were all risks that you were taking. So I just wanted to take a moment.
Yeah, totally. And, I think Mandy was held for like 5 days or something. I was there for, 40 hours or something. But I remember being in this, my experience being there was like sort of, it was an interesting experience, let's put it that way, But there was one moment where I was in the lift, and this policewoman, she was so angry at the whole experience of my interview with her and the communication, and she was like really angry, really, and then one moment I was in a lift with her, like suddenly it was just me and her in the lift, and she was saying something in Chinese, like, but really, and I thought this was the time she was going to hit me or beat me, and I was really like, okay, I'm ready for this, but at this, like, I was feeling it, because you're in that moment. But at that moment, I felt like this is what Tibetans are going through every day. At the end, I've got embassies calling, Japanese embassy was calling, putting pressure on China or calling my family, where am I, what am I doing? And, but Tibetans in this lift, confined in this private space, they don't have anyone. And that really broke my heart in that time. And while I was there outside the Olympic Committee, listening to, because I was outside the ethnic minority park, where it's like a theme park, basically, of all the minorities. And I could hear bloody Tibetans singing, like they were playing this thing. And that just sparked me. Like, as soon as I heard that, I knew, okay, I'm here. I was straight into this mission. Like, But hearing that and being in that lift, I wasn't scared for me, but I was, because I'm just not that kind of person. I react. But just the Tibetans inside Tibet in that moment, they were in my mind at that time. They don't have this platform, that they don't have this security and safety. So, and coming back after 2008, it was depressing. Like, we had to go straight into work. As soon as we arrived, we were campaigning for months. But after, when the world stopped watching and the Olympics ended, Tibetans disappeared, monks and nuns. There was martial law. Friends and family that I know from here, their relatives, teenagers, were shot. I always remember this young teenage Tibetan girl was shot on the street, and it was a hard time. It was depressing, but at the same time, you have to keep remind yourselves of the goals here, and then it was hard, but I think in all, we achieved so much, and what the current leaders of the Students for a Free Tibet and all the organizations, Uyghur Congress, World Uyghur Congress, and so on, it's amazing the work that you're doing and the energy that you have, and that you are really keeping up the momentum here, bringing us all together. Like, you have named this game the Genocide Games. They will for always be remembered as the Genocide Games. 2008 will be known as the Uprisings, and now the Genocide Games. And you have made people question so much about these games. Athletes are in dilemma, So I'm very proud of the work that you all have achieved.
Oh, and actually, we also have Tedong, who is the director of the Tibet Action Institute, joining us as well. And she took part in the 2008 Beijing Olympic boycotts. Thank you.
Thank you for having
me. Hi, Laden.
Hi, sorry, I'm late.
Before Laden, joins, I just wanted to really kind of, on the back of what Pema was saying, it was this incredible time, and I was there as an ally, and I try really hard to be as much of an ally as I possibly can to, for sure the Tibetan family that I've kind of grown into, but now obviously my Uyghur and Hong Konger friends and colleagues as well, and I was actually at the protest that Pema was kind of leading and taking part in, and I was just viewing. I wasn't there for any other. I was an observer, so I worked doing quite a lot of media liaison when I was there, and I was observing, and it was incredible to see Pema. It was really, really very moving for me as somebody who knew her, because we were both from the UK, to stand back and to watch her literally messaging how Tibetans were feeling and how wrong the occupation of Tibet is, and how her family and friends and relatives are in Tibet, locked down there, unable to raise the voice that she was so bravely raising in the middle of Beijing whilst the Olympic Games were going on. I mean, it was a real inspiration, and I've always been really thankful for kind of being there to witness that, and to to share that kind of real connection with Pema. So thank you. I just kind of wanted to raise that.
And then Hudden, could you actually talk a little bit more about what y'all did overall?
Sure, yes. I was just reflecting on that, looking at how locked down Beijing is right now and how little seems possible in terms of action or protest. Not that we believe that the athletes themselves don't have space and privilege and actually protection, I believe, to protest. But at 2008, it was just different. We did 8 direct actions in Beijing during the games themselves. So we had people, if I think of that first morning, the bird's nest, the banners that were hung outside the bird's nest stadium early morning, just 2 days before the game started, that said "One World, One Dream, Free Tibet." That moment was really quite remarkable because I believe, and this is sort of what Beijing is doing right now, what the Chinese governments are doing right now. They said everyone believed nothing was possible. The Chinese government had spent so much time building up a story, a narrative that everything was locked down, and that there was no way for anything to happen. That they had X number of secret police, X number of. I mean, they were even talking about missiles on the ground pointed up at the sky in case anything happened. It was there was a belief nothing was possible. And when those banners were deployed and those incredibly brave activists, were able to pull off that action in that moment, I remember we were doing the media from Thailand, from Bangkok. That was as close as we could get it, or that was the best place for us to be, the media team. And we would get some of the calls I got from journalists. I'll forget one in particular who hadn't really spoken with us much before that, but said, "It's how did you do it?" Like, she was just blown away. She just said, "It's remarkable. How did you pull this off?" And all I could think when I was talking to her was, wow, you all, so many people just bought into this idea that the Chinese government, the authorities are so good, nothing is possible. And if we had thought like that, then we would never have had those 8 actions successfully happen. And we would never have tried to get Tibetans like Pema into Beijing itself. We believed, of course the Chinese government is good. And for anybody, in terms of their security and their, especially now with the surveillance state. But at the time then, we just, so much of this is about believing, yeah, things are tough, things are difficult, the stakes are high, chances of success, there's always the chance that we won't be able to do this. But we did believe, and we believed because of the courage and the strength of Tibetans inside Tibet and what they had just shown us with the uprising in March and April. And, protests, people always, I think some people think it was sort of like, now looking back, this one protest was nearly 200 individual protests involving thousands of people over more than 2 months, March and April, and even beyond. And those protests, those actions took place under incredible security presence. At some point, at first things were sort of open. The first, say, days and maybe weeks of the March uprising, 2008, but at some point, Tibetans were really continuing to go out into the streets or engage in acts of protest, though it seemed impossible. And the protests, protests in Tibet have continued to this day, though it seems impossible. And they pay a very high price, so it seemed like the very least that we could do at that time. And that's what I would say right now with the athletes. If COVID restrictions and all make protests possible in the streets of Beijing like we did then, visa restrictions, the whole thing, they've gotten very good at vetting who comes into the country. And that all started back then, if you recall. But today, I really just, athletes, they're people of conscience. And some of them I know are conflicted about being in Beijing. And this is a moment to use their platform and to use their privilege and not to be silent, because if they're silent, it's what the Chinese government wants most.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing those experiences, both you and Pema. It's so invaluable to listen to folks who were actually directly involved back in 2008. A lot of this I'm learning and obviously very inspiring. And yeah, I just want to echo, like, think about just how impossible it is to really do anything in Beijing today. I mean, obviously the short-term reason is COVID, or in the name of COVID, there are these bubbles. But the long-term reason is just how we've seen the Chinese government develop itself into a massive surveillance state using the most cutting-edge technology. And actually a lot of that was tested first, on the Uyghurs, and then, sort of adopted, just across the country. But that in no way, just because it is, it's so much harder to even imagine being able to protest now, that in no way should diminish, your hard work and just the tremendous courage that you put into this back in 2008. Before I let everybody go, I just want to ask a quick question. What are some of the tactics that you learned during the 2008 campaign that you have carried on over to the 2022 campaign, or you see anybody else, in this coalition against the 2022 Beijing Olympics? Not narrowly in terms of like protest tactics. Obviously, none of us are currently in Beijing, but just some broader lessons that you see have been applied, or you want to see applied as we move forward.
Good question. I'd say, rather than it be more about tactics, it's more about the development of the strategy. So, as we all know, if you don't have a strategy, doesn't matter what tactic you take, it absolutely does not matter. Your tactic will end up eventually kind of falling off a cliff. But if you build a strategy and you have a plan and you have an objective of where you are going, and your tactics come into that strategy, you will undoubtedly be more successful. And that is the success of the 2008 Tibet movement campaign around the Olympics, undoubtedly. And that has for sure, and I know you have other guests later who will talk a bit more about this, that has been why this No Beijing 2022 campaign has been so successful, is because we built a strategy and we built a plan and we put our tactics into the strategy, as opposed to build a strategy around whatever tactics we wanted to put forward. So that's my come away from learning from 2008 how important having a strategy was.
Yeah, definitely. I'll just quickly say, coordinated action, working together with our allies, with our friends, Tibetan communities. I currently am a Tibetan community board member, and working alongside International Tibet Network and the Uyghur Congress, the Hong Kong A, like several Hong Kong groups in the UK right now, and we're working with many of them, people from Tigray region in East Africa. When we work together, we are louder. It's really hard to get content, especially for Tibetans right now, because of the clampdown, right? Because to get access. So we need to create content. We need to organize. And when we can, look what we did in 2008. Look what we are doing right now. And that's a collective action, right? That's collective working together. So that is one. So definitely keep working together. And I think trainings as a Tibetan community member, for me, is really important that we have trainings in our community, supporting our youth, giving them platforms, giving them opportunities, not forcing them to, or dictating to they should be like this, they shouldn't be, creating space and the harmony for them, I think is really, really important. That's what I want to say.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge that it's 7 o'clock right now, which means that the opening ceremony in Beijing has officially begun. And so
It's 8 p.m. in Beijing, but obviously anyone who can hear me now is watching this instead of that. So let's keep it that way.
Oh yeah, I guess there shouldn't be a specific time. And yeah, right now in this moment, the opening ceremony for the Beijing Olympics has just begun. So I just wanted to remind everyone to hashtag join. I will not watch. Join the campaign and make sure to tell your family and friends to not watch the sports washing of genocide. And now we'll continue with our regularly scheduled programming.
Bye, guys. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And as we've been saying throughout this entire broadcast, the cross-movement efforts leading up to these games has been unprecedented and inspiring, and obviously a a stark shift from 2008, but ultimately it's a tragedy of mass proportions because the Chinese government's list of human rights abuses globally has continued to grow at such an alarming rate that we're officially running out of room in our Oppressed by China team, club, crew, and we will actually now be joined by two of our most notable members. So first we have Zumurtai Arkin, who is the program manager at the World Uyghur Congress, and she is the leading Uyghur activist, currently based in Munich. Hello, Zumurtai.
Hi, guys.
Yeah, and also joining us right now is my friend Nathan Law, and he should be no stranger to all of you watching it. He was one of the key umbrella movement leaders in Hong Kong back in 2014. In 2016, he was elected as the youngest ever elected member of Hong Kong's legislature, and before being disqualified subsequently and sent to prison. And since 2020, when Hong Kong began having the national security law, he has been in exile in London.
Hey guys, thanks for the invitation.
I wanted to direct my first question at Zumurtai. So at least 3 million Uyghurs are being held by the Chinese government in political re-education camps, subjected to systemic torture, rape, indoctrination, forced sterilization. The list goes on. Can you give us an update on the current situation in East Turkestan?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak here. So the current situation is, is so bad. We're talking about a genocide. The Independent People's Tribunal in December in London came out with a verdict, based on 18 months of assessment of evidence that was available outside. They came to the verdict that there were crimes against humanity and a genocide occurring in East Turkestan, and that is based on, witness testimonies that have managed to escape the camps, that have actually experienced firsthand the torture, the sexual abuse, including rape, gang rape, mental and physical torture inside these camps. And this is still going on right now as the Olympic Games begin. And we have all Uyghurs in the diaspora, we have lost contact with our families for the past few years. I have stopped contacting my family since 2017, and the surveillance is extreme even outside the camps. Uyghur people are being monitored in all aspects of their lives, even in the privacy of their homes, where officials are being sent to these homes to really monitor everything that they're doing. So the restrictive environment is so severe that there's really no access to information from outside, and then for them to communicate with the outside world. So it has been isolated, pretty much just like Tibet. That's why we don't have, information a lot about Tibet and what's happening inside. And I think it can only raise alarms, because what is the Chinese government trying to hide so hard that they're not even, giving access to journalists, to even the UN, and the UN is just another topic. As we know, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is actually attending these Olympic Games, when the High Commissioner's office is actually working on a report assessing what is happening, the egregious crimes that are happening in the region. The Secretary General is attending these games, which is just horrible, because it's undermining the High Commissioner's office work on this issue. So overall, just to summarize, we're talking full-on genocide. With forced sterilization on Uyghur women, that is actually preventing an entire future generation of existing. So this is the case right now as the Beijing Games start.
Yeah, the situation in East Turkestan certainly is very, very concerning. I mean, we can only hope that Hong Kong, doesn't become another East Turkestan. But the situation in Hong Kong obviously has also deteriorated so much. Nathan, do you want to give everybody sort of an update, in terms of what is the latest, especially since the national security law was enacted in 2020?
Well, yeah, sure. We've heard a lot about kind of like Hong Kong people trying to draw comparison in between the future of Hong Kong to the current situation in East Turkestan and on the Uyghurs. in the protest, there are lots of signs saying that, oh, today Xinjiang, tomorrow's Hong Kong, or today's Tibet, tomorrow's Hong Kong, and things like this. And I think it really shows an anxiety of Hong Kong people when we look at what's happening in East Turkestan and what's happening on the Uyghur people, that we may associate ourselves whether Hong Kong would fall into that situation, like terrible human rights violations, terrible genocidal activities ongoing. And it really shows that for now, the way that we depict our future is really grim. After the implementation of the national security law, we've seen up to 100, more than 100 of Hong Kong activists or protesters charged under the law. That the most prominent case will be the 47 primary election case, that these people, they participated in a primary election in Hong Kong, and they are allegedly being charged with subversion charge, because the government says that if you participate in a primary election and you and you want to get the majority in the council in order to block government's bills, it constitutes a subversive action. So a lot of them are being thrown to jail, and without knowing how and why, and actually when they would be brought to court to proceed the official trial, while they've already been there for a year. And other than that, after the 2019 protest, we got more than tens of thousands of arrested, and more than 2,000 of them have been formally charged. Seeing all these things developing as an exile activist, looking at the deterioration of freedoms and civil society in Hong Kong is really daunting, because the contrast is very stark. Hong Kong used to be named as one of the freest city in Asia, even though we didn't really have democracy. But for the past few decades, we kind of like maintained a certain degree of freedom, because it was international financial center, and all these freedoms and were kind of like cornerstone to support the whole system. But for now, you can see the growing confidence of the Chinese Communist Party with their more technologically advanced totalitarianism than basically the Orwellian model, that they have full control over all this area, and they're putting more and more control over Hong Kong. So for now, I don't think any like observance of Hong Kong's political situation would feel very hopeful in short-term future, right? It is really difficult for us to depict one future in Hong Kong, let's say for 5 years, that everything will be overturned and our cherished democracy will come. But I do think that there's one thing that we have to bear in mind, which is China had already peaked. This is not some kind of like fantasy. It is really clear that it peaked in the time of 2008 and a few years onwards, and its economy is going on a downhill. When we used to talk about Chinese people, they kind of like signed a tacit contract, social contract with the government, while the government gave them economic prosperity and also that kind of like boost of nationalism, and in return to the silence of the people. But for now, these pillars are not standing quite solid. Actually, there will be a lot of problems in mainland China with an aging society, with a failure of industrial transformation, with an unemployment of a massive loads of unskilled workers, and also isolation on the international stage. I don't think the way that we put it forward was like kind of like wishful thinking. We actually will see that the CCP encountering a crisis on its legitimacy in the future, maybe not in a few years, but definitely it will come. And by then, there are possibility for change. And that's why I think for us, that people who are living overseas, that we camping so hard to raise awareness over these problems, that the world should listen and should take actions to address them, and to kind of craft a more assertive policy to China and to the PRC. I think these are really valuable advocacy, and maybe the results don't come in a few years of time, but we just have to keep going and have to keep telling the truth to the world.
Yeah, and I just want to take a second to acknowledge. I mean, like these people who are in jail right now, they're your friends, they're my friends, and sometimes we just find out about these news, these things on the news just because obviously neither of us and our friends abroad can go back to Hong Kong. So it feels increasingly difficult, and just thinking about the sort of the erosion of press freedom, academic freedom, and all that. The only sort of silver lining I would say is just in terms of how Hong Kong. I remember how marginalized the Hong Kong issue used to be on the international stage, just because no one would associate Hong Kong with human rights, mass scale human rights abuses. And now there's a lot of attention, and I know you testified actually just yesterday in the U.S. Congress with Speaker Pelosi there as well, specifically on the situation in Hong Kong. With respect to the Olympic Games, do you want to tell everybody briefly about how that went too, and what were some of the takeaways?
Yeah, I think after after I left Hong Kong, I landed in London, 2020 June. It was a few days before the implementation of the national security law. By then, the sentiment in London about China policy was still quite mixed. The Boris Johnson government was still trying to get Huawei into 5G, and everybody was trying to figure out how does the Sino-British relationship go in the future. But when we fast forward, when we look at the UK politics now, there are basically no one saying that we should trade with China, pretending nothing has happened in East Turkistan in Hong Kong. The narrative have changed so rapidly and drastically in just a matter of 1 year and a half when I was in the UK. The kind of my arrival act as a warning signal to the public, and that kind of warning signal was well received during the whole process. And when we just roll back to 2019, and the same process actually took place in the US, when I remember in 2014 when I was a student leader in Umbrella Movement, and in 2015 when Jeffrey and I we both started to do advocacy work in the Hill, there were no congressmen paying attention to what was happening. We proposed a bill that that there were only a handful of congressmen signed, and that was the golden era that we were talking about, having those really positive and closely connection in between US and China and UK and China. And by then, human rights issues were not addressed because these would be seen as endangering the relationship in between countries. So we didn't actually get support from the Obama administration. For example, when we were having the Umbrella Movement, which was a massive civil disobedience, peaceful movement, and there were geopolitical factors behind that. But for now, when we look at 2019, when we look at all those headlines about Hong Kong protests, it completely changed the narrative, and the China policy is undoubtedly the most bipartisan issue now. And if we're talking about whether we've got one issue in this very polarizing US and UK politics that both parties could agree on, that would definitely be the risk and the threat of the Chinese Communist Party and the way that we have to handle these things. So I think, yes, indeed, I joined testimony yesterday and many others throughout past few years' time. And I think the tide is definitely changing. And one remarkable fact about yesterday's hearing was Speaker Pelosi was one of the gave one of the testimonies, and she sat there the whole time listening to the whole 2 hours hearing, and it was really remarkable because we all know that how precious her time is, and most often when she testified, well, she would need to leave after her part, which was mostly the very first part of the whole section. But she stayed as she listened to testimonies from Uyghur, from Tibetan, and from Chinese human rights defenders, and she really did care about that. it is like you could see it as a way to understand how the U.S. politics are taking that problem, so human rights violation and genocidal issues in China seriously, and it's definitely a silver lining in this very, very terrible time.
Thank you, Nathan. And I just wanted to direct this particular question at Zumurtai. So China has a reputation of censoring all forms of dissidents, and many prominent Uyghur activists are being disappeared without cause at an alarming rate. Do you think that this crackdown on dissidents has intensified with the current Olympic Games, with the upcoming, happening right now, Olympic Games?
Well, the Chinese government has started, targeting dissidents, or they don't even have, permit. We don't have the environment where we get to even exercise our freedom of speech and expression, because that is something that the Chinese government made sure that would not be allowed. And if you look at the Urumqi uprising in 2009, which actually I was there during the uprising, I was visiting for the summer, and it was just crazy how quickly they've sent military to really squash on protesters, and these were peaceful protesters that had started. And over that summer, the environment was extremely restrictive. I just remember, our phones and internet connections were just cut off, and we couldn't even manage to tell the rest of my family back in Canada that we had safely arrived, because all communications with the exterior world was cut off. So that was in 2009. Imagine now in 2022, where millions of people are in the camps. They don't have access to that. They don't even have access to family visiting these camps. So it's the Chinese government has really managed to create this repressive environment where people, even if they had the liberty of speaking, they would not choose to speak because they are so afraid. They live in constant fear and anxiety that something they say might take them to camp, that they would end up, because this is what is happening. People are being taken to camps for absolutely no reason, for having communicated with their family members abroad. These are all the reasons that are sufficient enough to send you to a camp. So really, there's just no freedom at all, and even if there was, they wouldn't speak. And I think in the context of the games, it's even more, I think the repression is even more, I think you can feel it even more, and I think because the eyes of the world is looking at, pointed to the Beijing Olympic Games, people will not risk doing anything. I think, there's one thing that really resonated with me last time in, the personal conversation with Ladon and Mandy that came just earlier, that in 2008, they were able to go to China to protest. And today you're not even, thinking about it, because it's just not impossible. It's just not possible. And of course there's the pandemic, but even if there was no COVID right now, we wouldn't be even, thinking about that opportunity or possibility, because we know that we would be endangered. Just look at like all the foreigners that have been detained over the past few years. Look at the two Michaels, the Canadians that have been released after like almost 2 years of detention. So really going to China right now to protest, even for outsiders, is just not something that we can think of. So imagine the people who are living under that brutal repression. I don't think it's happening.
Yeah, and I mean certainly, and I just want to add, like, not only is it unimaginable to have a protest right now in mainland China, it is in fact unimaginable to have a protest even in Hong Kong. And again, this is nothing to do with COVID, even though we see Hong Kong authorities sort of using COVID as a pretext to prevent protests or to arrest people. But like the last thing anybody in Hong Kong would imagine in 2008 or even just a few years ago was that Hong Kong would be just as restrictive, if not even scarier to be in than mainland China for activists. The surveillance state, the national security state, that has just grown so much. And I guess so, there are many reasons to be pessimistic, and I guess I just want to ask both of you, before letting you go, how to how to still have hope, and what are some of the things that, especially for for viewers at home watching us right now, this live stream, ordinary people, what are some of the ideas, and what do you usually say to people who ask you this? What can they do to make even a tiny bit of difference?
Well, I guess I'll start answering that. Well, for me, I think the definition of an activist is to empower and enlighten people. And for us, we are not entitled to lose hope. Hope is by definition in our blood, and the things that we do. We're not saying that we must be like blindly optimistic, but we must believe that democracy, human rights, and freedoms are essential pursuit of human being, and we just have to keep running until we achieve the goal. And I think a lot of people share that feelings with us. The things that we see in people, for example, that they could give us hope when we see like people in Hong Kong, even though it's a really difficult situation that they are unable to do any like massive protest or political actions in a narrow term. But there are still a lot of people trying to do something. For example, going to court hearing, writing letters, doing a lot of backend support, supporting their families, trying to do independent media with very limited resources, etc. And it's these struggles that remind us the bravery of people, and the need of hope for all of us, and the hope actually inside them that inspires us. So I think when people look at situations like this, and when they are trying to help, of course, they could start with really talking to Hong Kongers around them, trying to understand a bit more, and trying to make them feel like they're being understood. And I think that's really important, especially for those people who just relocate to the other places. For example, in the UK, which is a major hub of Hong Kong diaspora community, that people need to feel like they are being understood, and to be accepted in that way. So I think it really helps them to talk to them. And of course, when you are more aware of the issues, just try to follow these great organizations that advise on, no matter like boycotting companies that are still buying things from the Xinjiang region, from all these forced laborers of Uyghur people, and also pay attention on rewarding the companies who are willing to pull off and to make economic sacrifice by doing so. And of course, just try to support all these organizations as much as we can. I think we all have our own position, and if you are a designer, maybe you could help them to do graphic stuff. If you are engineer, maybe you help them to do building up websites, things like this. I think that the most empowering thing is, to a certain point, you just have to ask yourself. It is not questions that you can ask the others, because we don't know who you are, not as much as you know yourself. So it's really important for anyone to up to that point to pick up some like self initiative, and to think a way for them.
Yeah, and if I can also add something, what gives me hope is really working with so many different groups on this campaign, but also from previous campaigns, is the resilience of our communities. No matter how, challenging times we're going through, I feel like we're such resilient and strong people, because, we've lost pretty much everything. Our homelands, we're not able to return to our homelands, to see family, to be, to contact family. Our basic rights have been stripped away from us. And even in these circumstances where we find ways to stay positive and to basically challenge the Chinese government and its narrative that is trying to spread around the world. And that really is something that gives me great hope, and inspires me to keep going. And I think for the audience that's watching us, every small action counts. Just the fact that you tuned in today to this alternative opening ceremony says a lot about, you know, the fact that you care about these issues, and that you're committing not to watch these genocide games. And also, just like Nathan pointed out, all these, you know, you're as a global citizen, you're consumer, as a consumer as well, your choice matters. So, you know, start maybe looking up brands that are using Uyghur forced labor in their supply chains, and maybe start boycotting these brands, or engaging with them directly and say, hey, like, I don't agree with you using that. So really, and then support the organizations that are doing the work, the frontline communities that are doing this work. I think that's really important as well. So yeah, just remember that I think your voice matters. We can also reach out to our government representatives as well, to let them know about what's happening, and to stand up for what's right, to be on the right side of history, because I guess in a few years' time, this will go down in history as a really dark period for human rights globally, and your choices today will matter later. So yeah, that's just a simple message.
And we actually just got an update that during the Beijing, or currently right now during the ceremony, that they just called the Taiwan team Chinese Taipei. So this is just another example of how they're trying to rewrite history. And I just wanted to send a message of solidarity to all the Taiwanese people watching, and just say, you know, keep Taiwan free.
Yeah, well, thank you to both of you for joining us. See you later.
See you.
Ooh, I mean, that was a really great question about keeping hope alive. And actually, yesterday in the New York protest, Pema Doma gave a speech about how she said the second that we let go of our hope is the second that the Chinese government ultimately wins. And so, in keeping the spirit of hope alive, Jeffrey, what is the craziest thing that you have done for Hong Kong as a Hong Konger?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. You know, I think a lot of what I'm about to say will echo what Nathan and I sort of talked about earlier. You know, just thinking about when we first started working on international advocacy for Hong Kong, very much after the umbrella movement in 2014. And you know, in my case especially, it was in Washington. You know, working with U.S. policymakers. It was just so difficult to get much of any attention. I mean, there would be like a handful of members of Congress and senators who would be working on this issue. But broadly speaking, there was Hong Kong in the human rights context was sort of an afterthought, because, well, first of all, because there was just so many places that had it worse, but also there was not enough understanding of what really was going on in Hong Kong, and the increasing crackdown by Xi Jinping. And so, in 2014, during the umbrella movement, I remember the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was first introduced, and it took us forever to get any momentum. I mean, in some sessions of Congress, there would be like two, sponsors, one Democrat and one Republican, never got through committee, never had a vote, and none of us thought that, there was any chance of that becoming law. And we just sort of persisted, and we met with folks on Capitol Hill and elsewhere in Washington. A lot was about educating, policymakers, having hearings and briefings, etc., and building that groundwork. Even though there was, honestly, I mean, there was no sign that this was ever going to get anywhere. And then obviously there was the 2019 protests that many people really didn't see coming, because of just how quiet Hong Kong civil society was, especially the year or two leading up to it. And then all of a sudden there was momentum in Washington, and since then, I mean, like, everybody talks about Hong Kong, obviously alongside Tibet, East Turkistan, Taiwan, etc. When they talk about China, and talking about China is no longer about what is going on in the core, right, in mainland itself, but also the periphery. In fact, more so the periphery, because that's really where you see, the Chinese government testing sort of its technology, its policy, that it will eventually apply across the country. So when the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act became law in 2019, that was really the piece of legislation that fundamentally changed U.S. policy on Hong Kong. And we were just doing that for 5 years, 5 full years, in fact. And it happened. So I think, it was not really sort of one moment, as I think it might be in your case, but it was really the sort of whole process of how change really slowly but eventually did occur. But yeah, why don't you also share with everybody what you consider the sort of craziest thing that you've done for Tibet? Well, I think you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Love that.
Yeah.
So actually, I would say that the craziest thing I did was actually probably my most recent direct action, which was back in December with no prior warning. We kind of just dropped everything and went to Lausanne, Switzerland, which is the headquarters for the International Olympic Committee. And I chained myself up to the Olympic rings outside the headquarters. And actually, that was still an experience that I'm like reeling from. So
I mean, I obviously, we all saw, that action in Switzerland, and I think, that is directly related, right, to what we're talking about today, which was, to protest the 2022 Olympics, and it was very important for you and your team to have done that. I think now should be a good time for us to bring in 2 new guests. I would like to introduce Zoe Bedford. I think she's in Sydney. She's the executive officer of the Australia-Tibet Council, and also John Jones, who is coming to this in London. He's the campaigns and advocacy manager at Free Tibet. And obviously, with relevance to what we're talking about today and right now, they're both prominent figures in the No Beijing 2022 Winter Olympics campaign.
So to start off, thank you for joining us today. And why did you come together as a coalition to plan the 2022 Beijing campaign boycott, especially knowing that the 2008 Beijing Olympics still went ahead despite such a push?
I don't mind going first. I can talk a bit about, for example, our latest protest yesterday, which I think really drove home why it has to be an international effort. Free Tibet and some of our friends, we organised a protest in central London yesterday in Piccadilly Circus. And in that crowd, there were Tibetans, there were Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, people who were affected by the CCP's foreign policy from places like Taiwan and Tigray, Chinese democracy protesters, MPs, Jewish groups, Muslims, people from so many different walks of life. And I'm sure there were people in other protests from southern Mongolia, from Kazakhstan. And they're all united with this common conviction that Beijing should not have been given these games because of the startling amount of human rights atrocities and intimidation and backing for regimes around the world carrying out their own human rights abuses that really lead to us needing to combine our efforts to amplify all of those different causes and bring them under one banner. And I think that the fact that we've learned from the last time that Beijing hosted the Olympics, the 2008 Beijing Olympics, was all the more reason to make this a global campaign. Those of us that were in the movement slightly before my time, I don't think it's before the time of some of the other people in this broadcast, they'll remember some of the most iconic protests against CCP rule in Tibet and the bloody crackdown in Tibet that took place just before the Games. So we've seen firsthand how the Chinese government can use events like the Olympics to carry out public relations exercises and literally get away with murder. And that's why we need a strong international response.
Yeah, And I'm just going to build on that. It's been a great solidarity campaign, and it's been fantastic to see, you know, Tibetans and Uyghurs and Hong Kongers, Chinese democracy activists all come together. I think it actually benefits China if they can sort of pretend that these issues are siloed, you know, like that the Tibet issue is just an issue of, you know, some disgruntled Tibetans in the diaspora, and, you know, that's how they like to paint it. But actually, these issues are, you know, all across China, you know, in all different groups, like from the east to the west, all across, you know, it's not a spot fire here and a spot fire there that China can just extinguish, you know, it's essentially a bonfire. There's nobody in China who's not been completely oppressed right now by the CCP, whether it's just under surveillance or whether it's like intense crackdowns in Tibet and lockdowns in Tibet, or, you know, a genocide facing the Uyghur people, you know. So somebody said in our protest today, it's just different degrees of oppression, you know, all across China. And they can't act like it's just, you know, a small case here or a small case there, or it's just a few angry people. We're talking about millions of people who are being oppressed by China. And I think it's been terrific for us all to get together and to be able to, you know, make sure the world's so aware of the different issues and how much China has been like negatively affecting the world. It spreads through, you know, other areas, the South China Sea, as John said, and other countries as well, the negative effect that China's having on the world. And yeah, it's been a good.
Yeah. Well, I know there has been some engagement with the IOC over the past year or so as part of this campaign. In both sort of your personal interactions with them and also perhaps some of your more general observations, how do you feel about the way IOC has handled the whole situation, especially the criticisms that we as activists have sort of brought up? You know, I just can't help but think about tennis star Peng Shuai, for instance, in China. So I would be interested to hear what both of you think about that.
Well, I haven't actually had any personal interactions with the IOC, being all the way down here in Australia, but you know how they've reacted has been absolutely appalling. And in fact, you know, mentioning Peng Shuai, they were completely complicit there. Like they actively went out of their way to try to, you know, help China prove that that Peng Shuai was not in danger. And you know, why would they do that? What's their motivation? You know, but the biggest question is like, who are they accountable to? Like in all the world, you have, you know, the IOC and other, you know, huge sporting bodies that have no accountability to, you know, any government or any people, you know, and they use this lack of accountability to keep, you know, doing the wrong thing with, you know, in a consequence-free environment. So that's why, you know, we need to have the activists around the world, because we bring the consequences. You know, these democratic diplomatic boycotts that have been happening, you know, no country would have done that if it wasn't for the pressure of the activists, you know, who are bringing up these cases and who were forcing their hand to act. You know, it's not, you know, goodness in the world isn't going to come through these bodies like this who actually just care about money and trade and all these things. It's going to come through, you know, pressure and activism, and that's how we're going to see some change.
Yeah, I think the IOC's handling of this whole affair, from the nomination process right up until now, as the games are getting started, has just been this exhibition of willful ignorance and stubbornness and blind faith and not caring about the damage that they're doing to people's lives. You know, it's almost like watching someone who doesn't know how to drive a car, like get in the car and immediately reverse it into a brick wall, and then rather than thinking about what they've just done, go looking for the next car. You know, it's this realization that it's not just sort of stupidity on their part, it's that they don't care if they crash the car. There's no consequences for them. So we've got to create these consequences. We try to do it the nice way. Like Zoe, I wasn't party to the meetings, but some of the other people in this broadcast, with lived experience of CCP oppression, told IOC, senior IOC members in their own words about what they experienced. The IOC had been warned twice in 2008 and now, before these 2022 Winter Games, about the consequences of doing public relations work for the Chinese Communist Party. They're aware of what happened in Tibet on the eve of the 2008 Summer Olympics. They're aware of the architecture of repression being built in the Uyghur region, the camps, the destruction of the civil liberties in Hong Kong, the threats that the CCP is posing to other peoples and other nations. And all of that has been brushed aside by the IOC. And it really did culminate, as you've mentioned, with their cat-handed management of this disappearance of Pang Shuai, where I think anyone who had any lingering doubts about the competence of this organization, about whether it was populated by clueless dinosaurs who need to be swept away as the organization is overhauled, I think that's the moment when they realized, dear God, this is the body running the foremost winter sports event in the world. And they're so clueless that we've reached a point where, it's only even governments like China that apparently can afford to host these events anymore, because several other countries have to pull out because there's such a financial burden. So you just think everything needs to be reformed from top to bottom. The way that we go about hosting these events needs to be given a thorough rethink, because they need to put the people first, not the needs of people throwing money at these events.
And I think it's fair to say that, the coalition, the movement across the world, has called the IOC unfit for purpose, and even, called for IOC President Thomas Bach to be fired, because of their handling of it, their poor handling of this, and the fact that they've been exposed to, actually have zero regard for human rights. They brought in this, human rights charter in 2017, but it doesn't begin until 2024 Summer Olympic Games, the Paris Olympic Games, and there's really it's really obvious why. I mean, they obviously wanted to give China a free pass. They knew that China would not be a suitable host if they held them to the standards, the human rights standards that they've just brought in. And so they didn't have the human rights standards start until 2024. I mean, they couldn't be more obvious about knowing that China is an unsuitable host, knowing about China's human rights violations, and then not caring and not acting and not doing anything about it.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you to both of you, for your time and your continued efforts within the movement. I think we should sort of have our next panel in right now. Mix, do you want to introduce your friends? You still on mute. we have the bingo.
Time's the charm. But the earlier when I was speaking on the Switzerland protest that I took action in, I was actually joined by these two fellow activists. And so Bima Domo is the campaigns director at Students for a Free Tibet, and Tenzin Kunjok is one of our foremost student activists. And they are both incredible freedom fighters in the movement. And actually, Bima is joining us from the SFT office, but early this morning, she was actually in Connecticut at the NBC studios. Can you talk a little bit more about why you were there?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Migs, for the kind introduction. This morning, I was in Connecticut at the NBC Sports Group Universal Studios, and we were with a group of Tibetan, Uyghur, and Hong Konger activists. And the reason why we decided to go to NBC is because although the ceremonies are happening inside Beijing, the office there is in full swing, and they are working, hard throughout the night to put on this Genocide Games propaganda opening ceremony. And so we arrived there around just before 2 a.m. In the morning. And when we got there, all the lights in the building were on, and there were lots of cars going back and forth in and out of the building. And, within the first 30 minutes that we were there, our group One of the employees stopped their car to talk to us and ask us what we were doing. When we told them why we were there, like this was like one of the first interactions we had within the first 30 minutes. They said, to be honest, we know everyone knows exactly what's going on. Everyone at NBC knows exactly what's going on, and we think it's terrible. But there's nothing we can do because NBC won't let us. And that was one of the first interactions we had. And they took a flyer from us, and they just kept going because when we said, "Well, can you speak to us?" They were like, "NBC won't let us." They said, "I have to put dinner on the table, and I can't lose my job." So that was the kind of interactions that we were having. We were there for an additional 4 hours or so, and we spoke with people going in and out of the building. We gave a lot of flyers out. There were several cars, there were several, to be honest, very fancy luxury cars going in and out, who we assume are producers or broadcasters or whatnot that are with NBC, and those cars would just speed right by us, and we chanted shame on NBC. And we had, Tursinai Yawadun, who's a concentration camp survivor, with us in that group. And she stood with us in the pouring rain for hours. And the big banner we had, and the small banners, all of them, they had messaging about human rights, about NBC's complicity. And our main message, our main goal was that every single NBC employee that came into work that day, that was taking part, whether big or small, in the airing of the genocide games, the last thing they think about, the last thing they see before entering the building for work that day, were those that were urging them not to silence human rights concerns. And to be able to see a human rights defender, a concentration camp survivor, right before they go in to air one of the most egregious propaganda shows of our generation, possibly since the 1936 Nazi Olympics opening ceremony.
Yeah, and well, thanks for sharing your experiences just a few hours ago, actually, and this is just another reminder, like as we are talking about obviously the why we should boycott the Beijing Olympics, activists, we are all also actively working on various different actions, and actually just yesterday I was in Washington, outside the Capitol. We had a rally organized by the victims of communism and other groups against the Olympics, and Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey actually also came and spoke, and Joey Seal, my friend, policy advisor at Hong Kong Watch, she was also there to speak on behalf of the Hong Kong community, and so I think she's here right now. So let's bring her in as well for this discussion.
Hi everyone. Good morning.
Mix, do you want to go ahead and
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge all the outpour of support that we've been getting in the live comment section, and to all the people that are watching right now. We just wanted to say thank you for your continued support, and please continue to send in any questions you have, and your support truly does mean a lot. Sorry, I'm a little disheveled now. Joey's sign is so cool. So I guess a question for all of you, and maybe specifically, is what do you think are the most striking differences between the 2008 campaign and the 2022 campaign against the China Olympics? We don't have to spend too much time on that question because I know that we've been kind of hitting that nail on the hammer for a while.
Yeah, I guess I can start, and maybe before I start, I want to also introduce Kunchok, who's here, our lovely friend. I don't know if you guys were going to do that next, maybe, but I don't know. This is Kunchok. She's an activist with SFT as well. Maybe she'll answer this question also. I think that the main differences that I've noticed between 2008 and 2022 is, firstly, I'm no longer like a 13-year-old or 12-year-old child. And I think that, back then when I was much younger, I saw this campaign and I saw so many people around the world standing in support with Tibet and the Tibetan cause. And then I saw the brutal crackdowns inside Tibet. And I saw, I grew up my entire teenage years every day waking up and not knowing how many Tibet. There was a time in my life where it was not, was there a self-immolation, but it was how many self-immolations were there this week, this month. And I think that the things that have happened since 2008, Tibet being ranked as the least free country or territory in the entire world, and the 1 million Tibetan children that are inside Tibet that are in residential schools, the Uyghur genocide, the egregious violations of human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. Last month I sat down with some of my Hong Kong friends and watched a documentary called Revolution of Our Times, and there were so many times where I almost just had to stand up and leave because it was just so painful to see what's being done to really compassionate, innocent, just normal human beings who just want freedom, and the way that the Chinese government has treated everybody. And I think that that's really resulted in an extremely powerful and strategic cross-movement allyship and campaign between Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and Tibetans, and also an intergenerational campaign, those from our elder generations who did a lot of the work in 2008 and built this incredible campaign, and then those younger generation folks who saw those campaigns and then also saw the crackdowns and repression. And I think that the theme of 2022's No Beijing Olympics campaign has really been just solidarity, whether it's intergenerational or cross-movement, and that's really what's kept the campaign alive and moving. So that's kind of the big difference that I think I've noticed.
A question that I had specifically for Kunchok, along with the question about 2008, is that you actually got arrested in Switzerland for staging the sit-in inside the IOC headquarters. What compelled you to take this risk? Because even before we left, I know that the people at SFT were briefing us, and they told us there is a large risk that you may get arrested. And before the rest of us, you were already very down. And I just remember thinking that I was just really inspired by that. And I think that's your bravery in part is what inspired me to ultimately take on that risk as well.
Yeah, thank you guys for inviting me. It was one of the most inspiring days of my life. It was 4 Tibetans and I, we entered the IOC building and did a peaceful sit-in protest for over 3 hours until we were forcibly removed by the police. And we were chanting for those 3 hours, trying to make our voices heard by Thomas Bach and the International Olympic Committee. And we were detained for about 4 hours, and we were informed that the IOC was pressing charges against us for a peaceful protest. And I think I did my last final in Switzerland. I think I was with Doma Doma when I was finishing everything up before this action. And I took this risk to increase and amplify the voices of many Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and Uyghurs who are being silenced by the Chinese Communist Party and who aren't allowed to speak up without risking not only their lives, but their family and friends' lives. And I wanted the world to know what was happening to Hong Kongers and Uyghurs and Tibetans.
I mean, I guess a quick follow-up question is, as we speak, the opening ceremonies are happening in Beijing. Do you still think that your sacrifice of getting arrested and having this on your record forever was worth it?
Yes, I believe it was worth it. I think this campaign has been pretty successful in that it's created so much awareness. A lot of my friends and Instagram followers and Facebook friends have messaged me saying they're amazed by everything that all my activist friends have done, how we've dropped everything to let the world know what's happening in East Turkistan, Hong Kong, and Tibet.
Yeah, well, that's very inspiring. And Joey, of course, we all know was also arrested in Athens last year. I mean, Joey, do you want to share a bit about your experience as well?
Yeah, so actually first when I was contacted by Pema about the action, I in a second told her, yes, I'm down to doing anything, because I felt at this very important historical moment when the IOC is rewarding a regime that is actively committing genocide in East Turkestan when they're awarding this regime that is trying to continuously press charges against my friends in Hong Kong and persecute the monks and also language activists in Tibet and have been occupying their lands for so many years. I feel like it is very, very important for us Hong Kongers and also as a part of the oppressed communities to amplify our voices and then also to expose the Chinese Communist Party's wrongdoings and human rights abuses against our people. So within a second, I immediately said, yes, I'm down to the action. And I am very glad and very proud of myself and Tella and all the others who have participated in the action, because obviously we saw a lot of international media outlets covering our story, covering our protests, and it happened. And our action has actually sparked a discussion among the international community on whether government should immediately be committing to a diplomatic boycott, whether sponsors should be dropping their sponsor deals to the Beijing Winter Olympics. And also, I felt like that is making a difference, and I felt like that is bringing a lot more attention to our struggles in Hong Kong, in Tibet, and also East Turkestan.
Something else that I wanted to bring up that I think is really important with the specific panel we have right now is, as we know, over 1 million Tibetan children and young people, some as young as 4 years old, are being held by the Chinese authorities in colonial boarding schools. Essentially, they're being ripped from the arms of their loving parents, from their culture, from their religion, and they're faced with very intense political indoctrination. What do you think are the long-term implications of these residential schools as it relates to the Tibetan identity?
I can go first. I think that the residential schools are really just a complete example of the cultural genocide that's been going on inside Tibet for decades now. And so when I first heard about these residential schools, I was just heartbroken to think that inside Tibet there are 1 million children right now today that are separated from their families, from their parents, and they're living in schools that are run by the CCP. They're basically being raised by the Chinese government, the same government that has raped and murdered their ancestors for decades. And what it really really shocked me was, or really made me feel extremely heartbroken, was when I heard about this policy that the Chinese government has, which is 5 + 2 = 0. And that to me, so that means basically it was uncovered in some Chinese government documents that they have this internal policy, which means that they encourage all of the schools and the parents, if if a Tibetan child is in a CCP school for 5 days and they go home for 2 days to spend time with their families, then that equals 0 progress in their indoctrination or in their process to becoming like a CCP loving citizen of China. And what really frightens me about this is that, within one generation, the CCP is trying to completely eradicate everything, about their Tibetan identity, from, the loss of their language. And there are accounts, that Tibetans inside Tibet have given to researchers at the risk of their own life, saying that they have actually witnessed children as young as, 3 or 4 years old being taken to these colonial boarding schools and coming back after 2 months. And not knowing how to express themselves in Tibetan any longer. That's the level of just brutal, complete cultural genocide the Chinese government is attempting inside Tibet right now. And I think it kind of all ties back also to 2008, because after 2008 Olympics, during the Olympics and following after the uprisings and the self-immolations, what were Tibetans calling for? They were all calling for freedom for Tibet and for the return of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, to Tibet. He's been a refugee since he had fled Tibet in 1959. And now, we see language activists like Tashi Wangjuk. Tashi Wangjuk spent 5 years in prison, and, just about 1 year after he was released, it was earlier this month in January, he went to, Chinese Twitter and also commented again on the language policies, and was, summoned for interrogation by the Chinese authorities. This really just to me tells us that in exile around the world, Tibetans and allies and those in solidarity with Tibetans need to listen to the voices of Tibetans inside Tibet who have sacrificed everything. They have sacrificed their livelihood. Tashi Wangjuk was a businessman who had his family. He could have stayed silent and led a normal life, but he chose to speak out when he saw injustice. And when Tibetans inside Tibet are able to stand up to injustice with that level of courage and bravery, the least that we can do is amplify their message. And I think the residential boarding schools, the colonial boarding schools that are being operated inside Tibet are, one of the primary places we need to start. And, we've heard stories from Tibetans inside Tibet, and now it's our job to amplify those stories and to take action on them. So that's something that would continue beyond the Olympics as well.
And I don't think that we can, as you said, I don't, mentioning amplification of Tibetan voices, the person that comes to mind immediately is Tundu Bongchin, who is a Tibetan filmmaker who was actually imprisoned in 2008 for his documentary Leaving Fear Behind, which documents the voices of ordinary Tibetan people living in Tibet and their views on the current state of Tibet's occupation. He was actually just recently nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize, which is incredible. What was your reaction when you heard the news?
I remember opening Instagram, and that's how I personally found out. And I was amazed, excited, shocked. Those are some of the words I felt. I can't really explain how I felt. It was just like a burst of excitement. And I'm so proud and just so, I guess, still amazed. And I watched I remember watching the documentary, and I usually don't cry, but when I was watching it, I had a few tears coming down. It was just so inspiring to see people in Tibet voice their opinions. But also it's scary to think what's happening to them right now, what's happening to their family members and friends.
Yeah, well, thanks to both of you for sharing that. I think I'm gonna turn to Joey right now. Joey, for some reason you changed your virtual background. But a moment ago, for those of you who've been watching, the background was 我唔會睇 in Cantonese, which is basically I will not watch in English. And Joey, I know you've been working on the I will not watch campaign with others as well for the past several months. Can you tell us a bit more about that and maybe some of the rallies that you and I both have done as well, and others here specifically targeting NBC?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, when the Chinese Communist Party is committing a genocide in East Turkestan, we are finding them actively trying to make use of the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics as a platform to export their propagandas to try to sports wash human rights abuses against our people in Hong Kong, Tibet, and also East Turkestan. They're trying to make use of this very prominent, very important international sports event to cover up their atrocities against our people. So I think it is really very important for every individual across the globe in so many different countries and regions to realize that any forms of participation, you trying to watch the Olympics Games is actually you helping to legitimize the Chinese Communist Parties against our atrocities against our people. And any forms of involvement in the Beijing Winter Olympics Games is basically equivalent to you endorsing the Beijing regime, their abuses against our own people who are still struggling in Hong Kong, in Tibet, and also in East Turkestan. So activists from the Uyghur, Tibet, and also Hong Kong community have been pushing for this I Will Not Watch campaign, where we encourage individuals to join us in our boycott in not watching the games. We're trying to, we have been organizing so many different protests at NBC here in the States. We have been protesting outside BBC and also CBC in Canada and also in the UK, asking this very huge broadcasting networks to also to drop their broadcasting deals and not to cover the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. And I think Pema herself this morning just did a protest outside the NBC studio outside in Connecticut. So we have been doing a lot of these actions, campaigns online and also in person. So I think it is really, really important for every one of you who is watching this alternative opening ceremony right now, or who are concerned about our struggles in Tibet, East Turkestan, and Hong Kong, that this is a very, very simple thing that you can do. It's not to tune into the Olympic Games at all, and also to encourage your friends and also relatives to join you in a boycott. And I think there is a very good list compiled by Uyghur, Tibet, and also Hong Kong activists with the different songs produced by our artists. There are documentaries and also films produced or about our struggles. And as Kunchut have mentioned that, as Kunchut and also Pema have mentioned that the Chinese Communist Party is now very actively trying to erase our history. They're trying to cleanse our culture and also language. So I think instead of watching the games, you can use this very precious opportunity to educate yourselves about our history and also our struggles. So just visit our website on iwillnotwatch.org, and you will find a very good list of books, songs, and also documentaries.
Yeah, so again, for everybody watching, it is iwillnotwatch.org. Feel free to go there. There's a lot of material and more information about the No Beijing Olympics campaign. And then before I let you all go, I just want to say I'm reading Josh Rogan's Twitter feed right now, the Washington Post opinion writer, and it seems like he's watching the coverage of, I'm not sure whether this is NBC News or NBC Sports, but apparently, I mean, there's a lot of financial interest in terms of the broadcasting deal and the IOC obviously, and also these sponsors, and we really cannot trust corporations to do the right thing most of the time, and the way I think as I'm seeing it right now, it seems like NBC is basically just trying to take a sort of both sides approach. Western governments allege this and that, and then the Chinese government sort of empathetically denies all of the allegations, and the way that NBC is trying to frame the concerns about human rights in East Turkistan and elsewhere as a sort of this is what the Biden administration is saying, rather than actually reporting on the situation on the ground. And I think it's just so shameful that various different arms of NBC Universal, whether it's the sports division or maybe perhaps even the news division, etc., they are all complicit in this. And so I just want to raise that and just say it's very important to keep boycotting the games. This is just the beginning. This is going to last for a few weeks, and hopefully everybody watching this will know not to watch any of the coverage for the rest of the event. And with that said, I think we should let all of you go, and then we are almost wrapping up. I think there are a few sort of announcements that I can sort of make here before we sort of conclude. Speaking of Twitter, I think some of you might notice the Tibet network Twitter was taken offline. I think it was suspended just a couple of hours ago ahead of the opening ceremony. I don't think any one of us really knows what's going on. It could be Chinese trolls, sort of mass reporting accounts as we've seen in the past. But I just thought we should bring that up. It's not easy to be organizing this. The Tibet network and many other groups have been so involved and so helpful in all of that, and obviously also all the guests from literally all around the world who join us. Thank you them for taking the time. Mix, do you have anything to add before we sort of wrap it up?
Yeah, super similar to what you've been saying. I just wanted to thank everyone who has attended our alternative Olympic opening ceremony. It was very much a huge collective and intensive behind-the-scenes effort. And I also want to take the time to thank every single activist that has been working so tirelessly up until these opening ceremonies, and who will continue to work tirelessly on behalf of everyone that has been and continues to be oppressed under the Chinese government's rule. And even though the games were not moved, and even though the IOC did not hear our pleas or heard our pleas and chose to ignore them, there are still so many incredible actions and so many incredible efforts that we can make on an individual and group level. And again, that is just the I Will Not Watch campaign. Tell your friends, tell your families, tell your teachers, tell everyone to not watch the Olympics and not support the genocide games. So with that, we conclude our alternate opening ceremony. Thank you so much, everyone, again, from the bottom of our hearts. And thank you in advance for not watching any Olympic coverage moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. And I think right now there's a video to show, I think. So we'll wait for that.
Oh, I guess while we're